If you have your own Linux server, whether it is at home or in the cloud, you might have noticed continuous SSH brute force attacks. You also might have noticed continuous port scanning attacks and also pinging from different IP addresses. All the servers I have ever owned have experienced this kind of attacks, and also according to several posts on forums, I'm not alone. There are solutions such as fail to ban. It will temporarily block the IP address that tries to access your server through SSH and fails multiple times. However, attackers will still know that your server is online and will try to access it again and again. For the server to be invisible, it must appear as an unused IP address. It means that the server should not respond to any requests. You might ask, what's the purpose of the server if it does not respond to any requests? Well, probably not much. However, it is possible to configure a server to respond only to specific requests. A simple way to achieve this is to use port knocking. To access a server, you first need to knock specific ports in a specific sequence. Port knocking is done by simply sending packets to specific ports. When you knock server using a correct sequence, firewall grants your IP address access to the server. There are several discussions whether this method is security by obscurity. I think it's fair to say that this method is a security by authentication, since port sequence is basically a pre-shared key. Also important to mention that this sequence is basically sent in plain text, unencrypted, which means that it's possible for the attacker to sniff traffic between you and server and simply note the sequence and use it to gain access. This method does make your server to appear as non-existent and invisible. However, there is another, more secure and less tedious method. I'm sure you have heard about OpenVPN, which might be pushed away by WireGuard soon. I'm not going to go into details about the workings of OpenVPN. However, I do want to mention that it is pretty easy to configure OpenVPN server to respond only to specific requests. If you're unfamiliar with HMAC authentication, it stands for hash-based message authentication code. It uses a pre-shared key just like in the port knocking solution. When client wants to connect to server, it first prepares a request, then it combines this request with a pre-shared key. The combination then is hashed together. The client then sends the request and the calculated hash to server. When server receives the request and hash, it does exactly the same calculation as the client did. Then server compares the received hash and the calculated hash. If hashes match, then server accepts the request and responds to the client, and then the communication begins. If hashes don't match, then server simply doesn't respond, which basically makes your server invisible. This method is more secure because it does not expose your pre-shared key in plain text. Also, you get a VPN tunnel which you can use to access your server over encrypted channel. This method is also more user-friendly because it's definitely less cumbersome to connect to an OpenVPN server rather than to knock the ports around. You also have to remember that your firewall must be configured to drop all requests except for the OpenVPN port, which is typically 1194. To make server appear as an unused IP address, avoid associating it with any domain name. You see, if you associate a domain name with the IP address of your server, it will appear as probably operational. It will also make it easier to reveal owner of the server. If the IP address appears as non-existing, it will be less interesting to hackers and bots out there.